The Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta is known as the greatest traveler of pre-modern times. He lived in the 14th century CE, leaving his homeland at the age of 21 to make the holy pilgrimage to Mecca. He performed a series of extraordinary journeys that spanned nearly 3 decades and took him as far away as India and China, but also to the Volga River Valley south of Tanzania. The narrative of his travels is a unique account on Islamic and medieval history that was placed by the historians within the rich, trans-hemispheric cultural setting of the history of the medieval world. Battuta was born in Tangier, part of modern-day Morocco, on February 25, 1304. The men in Ibn Battuta's family were legal scholars, and he was raised with a focus on education. However, there was no madras or college of higher learning in Tangier. Thus, Ibn Battuta's urge to travel was spurred by interest in finding the best teachers and the best libraries, which were in Alexandria, Cairo, and Damascus. He also wanted to make the pilgrimage to Mecca, called the Hajj, as soon as possible out of eagerness and devotion to his faith. He was a Moroccan traveler, geographer, botanist, and man of the law. At times he was a judge. However, he is best known as a traveler and explorer, whose account documents his travels and excursions over a period of almost 30 years, covering some 73,000 miles and visiting the equivalent of 44 modern countries, which were then mostly under the governments of Muslim leaders of the Word of Islam, or Dar al-Islam. Ibn Battuta started his travels in 1325 when he was 21 years old. His main reason to travel was to go on a Hajj, or a pilgrimage to Mecca, to fulfill the 5th pillar of Islam. The Muslim world is depicted on the first map above at around 1300. The second map displays Ibn Battuta's travel routes. Ibn Battuta mostly traveled through regions inside the Black Border, denoting the Dar al-Islam, where there were Muslim-led administrations. Additionally, Muslim traders had already made forays into China, Indonesia, and the other countries, establishing little Muslim communities throughout the world.
As he was traveling across Libya, he signed a marriage contract to a daughter of a Tunisian official. He had a dispute with his father-in-law and broke off the marriage soon after. Instead, he decided to marry the daughter of another pilgrim who was a scholar from Fez. Later, when Ibn Battuta reached Alexandria, he wouldn't enter the city until a favorable omen arrived, but he was persuaded to go in when the judge convinced him. While he was there and in Cairo, he stayed in college dormitories. He took a trip down the Nile after staying in Cairo for about 1 month. While traveling on the land next to the river, he stayed in houses and dormitories. He left the Nile and went on camel with a group of Bedouin Arabs toward the Red Sea. When he reached the sea 15 days later, he found that the local ruling family was in revolt against the Mamluk governor. They violently threatened him and forced Battuta to retrace his steps back to Cairo and start the journey all over again. Then he left Cairo again and headed to Damascus, Syria, following the royal road in order to connect to a Hajj caravan that would take him to Mecca. He had time before the next Hajj, so he detoured the holy sites at Hebron, a holy site for Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and he also went to Jerusalem. Then he traveled back to Damascus. He stays in Damascus and enjoys the arts and studies. He marries another wife and has a son. He also visited the Cave of Blood and talked with scholars and judges while he was there. He stayed for 24 days.
Ibn Battuta rode alongside a caravan of a couple thousand people from Damascus to Medina, which is expected to take 45 to 60 days, and the caravan was being protected by the Mamluk army. Ibn Battuta was still a poor and unemployed merchant at this time and had to rely on donations and charities to provide for his expenses like the animal he would ride on, food, and other necessities. Ibn Battuta stayed in Medina for 4 days, and in those 4 days, he stayed in the holy mosque for all those nights. He prayed to God and visited holy sites during the day. Ibn Battuta then set off to Mecca. In Mecca, Ibn Battuta performed his rituals while wearing simple white Aram clothes. He firstly went to Kaaba and performed his duties. On the other days, he performed other traditional rituals and actions associated with Islam. Ibn Battuta stayed in Mecca for 3 weeks and visited holy sites and met important people and then left. Ibn Battuta joined the official caravan of the Persian state with other pilgrims. The whole journey took about 44 days. In Al-Najaf, Ibn Battuta visited a holy site which was especially important for the Shia community, and Ibn Battuta met the Sufi Muslims in Al-Najaf. Sufi Muslims attracted Ibn Battuta due to their ways of trying to obtain direct experience of Allah through love and expression of knowledge through poetry or music. Ibn Battuta arrived at the famous city of Basra, but he was heavily disappointed. The city had declined in population and importance, and Ibn Battuta attended a Friday service in a mosque and was disappointed by the grammar mistakes of their leader. Ibn Battuta then took a small sailboat to Abadan. Ibn Battuta headed to Asafan. He lodged at Asafan at a large Sufi center and met with religious and legal scholars. Ibn Battuta then visited Shiraz, which was flourishing due to refugees avoiding the Mongols. Ibn Battuta stayed at a dormitory attached to a mosque and visited mosques and tombs and prayed the piety of the women in Shiraz. He then left for the major city of Baghdad.
Ibn Battuta arrived in Baghdad, a center of learning, in 1327, where he was shown great hospitality. Baghdad was destroyed by a Mongol invasion, and he had gone there to honor its past and walk among the ruins. The picture on the left is one of the oldest universities in the world, built in 1227, and it was still operating by the time he had arrived. He was brought to many various public bathhouses, as seen on the right, because cleanliness was encouraged by the Quran, and because, quote, it was a duty of every Muslim to be as clean as possible. He traveled with a great king, or the Il Khan, named Abu Sayyid, and described him as being the most beautiful of God's creatures. He went with the king to the king's summer palace by a royal caravan, and then took a separate caravan to travel to Tabriz, a great center of learning and culture. He spent very little time there, only to head back to Baghdad while touring some of the places Marco Polo had visited, and there he met a Hajj caravan that would take him to Mecca. He lived in Mecca, leading a life of prayer, fellowship, and learning, and he took a break after traveling over 4,000 miles in only 1 year, visiting many scholars, saints, kings, and the great cities of Iraq and Western Persia. He traveled around East Africa and then the Red Sea by a dhow. It was his first time traveling not by land, and the Red Sea was not easy to navigate through. But once he made it through, he followed it to the Arabian Sea, and he traveled to many coastal cities along the way. He went along the travel network of Muslim communities, where he was always welcomed as a fellow Muslim, scholar, and pilgrim. He decided to leave the great city of Aden and head to Kilwa, an important trading city on the eastern coast of Africa. Here he was thought to have prayed in the great mosque of Kilwa. After taking a short trip along the Gulf of Oman, where he almost died at sea, Ibn Battuta was thinking about a return trip to Mecca, his third visit. Traveling mostly by land now, he reached Mecca in the winter of 1330.
Trip to Anatolia. After his third pilgrimage, Battuta was interested in working under the Sultan of Delhi, who was welcoming scholars and giving high-paying jobs. Looking for a guide to take him to India for this opportunity was unsuccessful, and traveled north instead to Anatolia in modern-day Turkey. From there, he was able to connect with Turkish caravans going to India. He then traveled back into Egypt, where he met a friend, and they went by caravan to Damascus, Syria, and from there set out to Anatolia. Ibn Battuta's stay in Turkey. Once Battuta reached Turkey, he found that the Turks were very kind and showed him around the cities and towns. He wrote about the Citadel of Antalya, some ruins that are a popular modern tourist destination, and was welcomed into a fraternity of Muslim brothers. He stayed at the homes of important leaders, where he was shown gifts like usual, as well as an introduction to the next host Ibn Battuta would stay with, the Golden Horde. He then sailed across the Black Sea and then made a 700-mile trip to the Volga River in Russia under the protection of the king of the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde was one of the 4 sections that the Mongol Empire was split into after Genghis Khan's death. Visit to the Byzantine Empire.
Battuta left towards Constantinople because his wife was going to give birth and wanted to be by her father, the king of the Byzantine Empire. So, in July 1332, they set out for Constantinople with about 5,000 horsemen, 500 of her personal servants and soldiers, 200 slave girls, 20 Indian and Greek pages, 400 wagons, 2,000 horses, and about 500 oxen and camels. There he met the Emperor Anaxandros III and saw the sights of the Byzantine Empire and visited the Hagia Sophia.
Soon after, the Sultan of Delhi sent Ibn Battuta off to China. He arrived in the port of Calicut after leaving Delhi, but his ship was stopped by Chinese junks, and it broke apart because of a violent storm. He lost everything then, but continued on to China by going through the Maldive Islands, then to Sri Lanka, making a pilgrimage to the sacred Adam's Peak. After a series of failures, he was encouraged to travel to China. He went up the Manga River to sell it, and afterwards went to Samudra. For about 40 days, Ibn Battuta sailed to China and took a trip to the Great Canal in Beijing. He also seemed to have been in a culture shock, which is discomfort at being in a culture he didn't understand or appreciate. Ibn Battuta then began his return home with the winter monsoon scaring him back. He returned to Samudra on the island of Sumatra. He stayed with the Sultan again for a few weeks, continued to Quilin, India, and then up to Calicut. He did not stay in India, but instead took another trip to Mecca and went on yet another Hajj. He then sailed north and went through Persia. Eventually, he completed his journey through the Syrian desert and arrived in Damascus. The Black Death was becoming to be rampant around him, yet that did not stop him from making his fourth and final Hajj. With death surrounding him everywhere he went, he felt the need to go home. In 1354, the Sultan of Morocco wanted to learn about Ibn Battuta's trips, so he ordered him to write down his travels for the entertainment of his family and others. The Sultan hired Ibn Juzay, a young writer Ibn Battuta had met earlier on his trips, and he wrote down the stories, starting with the beginning of the journeys 29 years ago, in form of a travel book called the Rihla, meaning voyage in Arabic. The book was then translated in the 19th century by European scholars and began to receive widespread attention. Ibn Battuta's life after the Rihla is unknown, but he is thought to have died in 1368 or 1369. And, fun fact, a crater on the moon is named after him.